Morning, folks. I just want to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about the Edgeworth box. So, what are we thinking about there? We're thinking about the Edgeworth box. And that's going to help us think about gains from exchange and trade between two people. So, we are thinking about exchange of two goods, X and Y, between two people. But for the moment, let's just start off with our first person, Ayanda. She has two goods, X, which we say is kilograms of coffee, and Y, which we say is gigabytes of data. So we then want to think about her preferences between these two goods. And then when we think about this, we can typically say that we can represent her preferences by a utility function. And so she will have a utility function u, x, y of about these two goods. For the moment, we're just going to start and say she has Cobb-Douglas preferences where she likes the two goods equally. So Ayanda likes the two goods approximately equally and raises both of them to the power 1/2 in her utility function. Now, when we think about this, we can say we can represent her utility and her preferences in terms of indifference curves. Okay. So for example, here I've drawn three indifference curves for Ayanda, and we can label these as U1, U2, and U3. Now, what we also know, and we always think about here, is that when we think about Ayanda's preferences in her utility, she likes to get more stuff. She likes consuming more things. So more coffee and more gigabytes of data are better for her. So her utility increases as she moves from U1 to U2 to U3, up from one indifference curve to the other. Now, when thinking about that, we are now going to also think a little bit about how we're going to take Ayanda and then combine her preferences with what we think about when we have a second person involved. So what we have to do when we add that second person is think through what's going to happen when we introduce a second person who has similar preferences to Ayanda. Now, what we're going to think about here is that we're going to have a second person, Bongani. And Bongani, what he's going to have is he's going to have similar preferences to Ayanda. He's going to have preferences which are also Cobb-Douglas. So here we have Ayanda's preferences, UA for XA and YA, and then Bongani, who likes XB and YB. He's similarly going to have Cobb-Douglas preferences where each is raised to the power 1/2. And then what we can do is we can think a little bit about how we would go about thinking about what Bongani actually likes here. And so when we're thinking about what Bongani likes, we can then take for Bongani and say, okay, let us now add some more axes to this figure. We had YA and we had YA when we're looking at Ayanda, but now we also want to think about what happens when we add Bongani. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to add some more axes to this box. Okay, so we've got the one line here. And then another. Okay, and now what we're going to think about is that we're going to have these two goods and we're going to be thinking about what Bongani would like. And Bongani likes two goods, and we're going to say that he's going to like YB, and YB is going to be increasing as we go from the top to the bottom of the Edgeworth box. He also likes XB, so he likes coffee, and XB is going to increase as we go from right to left along the Edgeworth box. Now, when we're thinking about Aisha, I now have to also think through a little bit about what we do when we now reintroduce the labeling for her. So Aisha, what does she like? She likes to have more of the good, X. She also likes to have more of the data, Y, and so then as we go from top to bottom, she's getting more of that. Now you notice that we've got Ayanda's preferences represented by indifference curves. But we also want to think about having Bongani's preferences represented by indifference curves. So where we had an increase in utility for Ayanda going from the bottom to the top of the curve, so moving northeast, we now want to think how we'd actually have more utility for Bongani. So we need to think about introducing his indifference curves. So we can do that now by drawing some indifference curves for him. And so here I've drawn 4 indifference curves for Bongani. And what we can see is that Bongani's utility is increasing as we move from the top northeast corner down to the southwest corner. That is increasing his utility. He's going from U1 to U2 to U3 to U4. He is getting more utility as he moves from northeast to southwest. The next question is, okay, so what are we thinking here when we've got these indifference curves? Well, we're going to have to think a little bit through what each of them likes and whether what the starting point is going to be. So we can start off by saying that they're going to get some endowment that they start off with, say point Z. And that endowment is going to be a point where we say, okay, Bongani has some amount of X, and his amount of X is going to be X, Z, B. For Bongani, his amount of Y is going to be Y, Z, B. Those are both for Bongani. That's the amount of X and Y that he's going to have at his endowment. And then for Aisha, what we're going to have is she's going to have X, Z, A, and Bongani is going, and Aisha is going to have Y, Z, A. Now these all correspond to point Z. And we can look at those on the box here where we can see we've got coordinates for Z, and then we can say for Aisha she has XZA and she has YZA. And then we can say for Bongani that he has XZB and he has YZB. So these are the amounts of the goods that Bongani and Ayanda have. We can see that corresponding to a point in the Edgeworth box, and we can see that it lies on indifference curves for the two of them. This point Z lies on U3 for Bongani, and it lies on U1 for Aisha. That just happens to be the case in terms of the indifference curves I've drawn here. Depending on the shape of the curves, we could get different labels for the different curves that they've arrived at. And we're just going to stop there for now.